Welcome to another episode of Carib 21, where we share Caribbean lifestyle and culture. In today's video, we'll be celebrating the beautiful twin islands of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago gained independence 1962, August 31st, and became a republic in 1976 on August 1. In today's video, I'll be highlighting how Trinidad and Tobago became independent, became a republic, and became the most powerful island in the Caribbean. I'll take you on a journey on the ups and downs of the history of Trinidad and Tobago.
From the love of liberty in the voice of hope and proud, with boundless faith in our destiny, we solemnly declare. Side by side we stand, island of the blue Caribbean Sea, this unnated land, we pledge our lives to thee. Here every queen and bird find an equal place, and may God bless our nation. Here every queen and bird find an equal place, and may God bless our nation.
In this video, I will attempt to highlight the contribution of Trinidad and Tobago to the Caribbean and to the wider world in terms of sports, in terms of culture, in terms of food, in terms of finances. I'm going to attempt to highlight some of the major contribution that the beautiful twin island of Trinidad and Tobago has contributed to the wider world. Before I do that, I'll give you a brief 300-year history of Trinidad and Tobago.
The history of Trinidad and Tobago begins with the settlements of the islands by indigenous First Peoples. Trinidad was visited by Christopher Columbus on his third voyage in 1498. He never landed in Tobago, and he claimed in the name of Spain. Trinidad was administered by Spanish hands until 1797, but it was largely settled by French colonists. Tobago changed hands between the British, French, Dutch, and Colanders, but eventually ended up in British hands following the Second Treaty of Paris. In 1889, the two islands were incorporated into a single political entity. Trinidad and Tobago obtained its independence from the British Empire in 1962 and became a republic in 1976.
Trinidad and Tobago is the second largest English-speaking island in the Caribbean. Jamaica is number one. Trinidad has over 1.4 million, and Jamaica is heading to 3 million in the population. And I know when I describe Trinidad as the most powerful island in the Caribbean, I know people will say, wait, stop. I thought Jamaica was. And I would say to that, Jamaica, you could say Jamaica is the most popular island because of its culture with Bob Marley. But in terms of Trinidad, I'm going to explain why Trinidad, over the past 100 years, have been the most powerful island in terms of its contribution to the wider Caribbean. What made Trinidad such a powerful force is that Trinidad was one of those early countries or islands to discover oil. Oil was discovered in Trinidad in 1855, and in the early 19th century, 1905, between 1905 and 1907, they started drilling oil. So for the early part of that century, Trinidad was one of the most developed, was bringing in that oil money. And Trinidad at one point was top 10 in the world in terms of oil production, in terms of the amount of barrel of oil that Trinidad produce on a daily basis. So that is one of the first things that made Trinidad one of the strongest economy in the Caribbean coming out of slavery because of the discovery of oil. And what happened after independence or during independence in terms of the government decision, their decision making, would make Trinidad the most powerful island in the Caribbean, especially in the early 1900s. So in order to get a full understanding of the impact that Trinidad and Tobago had on the Caribbean in the early 19th century, I would have to introduce you to the West Indies. Most people outside of the Caribbean have no idea what the West Indies is, what the West Indies is about. And I would say there are people in the Caribbean that only associate the West Indies with cricket. So the West Indies is a part of the Caribbean, but the Caribbean is not a part of the West Indies. And let me explain. So what the West Indies is, pretty much the Caribbean, like the continent of Africa, was pretty much colonized by different European nations. So the West Indies is a group of islands that were colonized by the British government over 300 years. In the Caribbean region, European countries fought battles over the past 400 years to take over, to colonize different islands. So in that you had the French, you had the British, you had Christopher Columbus and the Spanish. You had different countries outside of Europe. So for example, in the Caribbean, there's Cuba, there's Dominican Republic, there's Haiti, there's the British Virgin Island, there's the US Virgin Island, there is Martinique, there's Saint Martin. All of those are in the Caribbean, but they are not a part of the West Indies. So the West Indies is pretty much the British Caribbean islands. In 1958, the British government put together the West Indies Federation with the goal to create a political union between 10 Caribbean islands, including Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, Montserrat, and there are a few other islands that were a part of that. So that would be 10 islands that were colonized by the Brits, and they wanted to create a union that would pretty much create one government for all islands. So they put together, there was a flag, the West Indies flag. I'll put it up on the screen somewhere. There's a coat of arms. And in that process, what they pretty much, the goal was to create one government in the Caribbean, pretty much similar to what they did in Australia and they did in Canada. So for example, in Canada, we have different provinces. We have Ontario, we have Montreal, we have British Columbia. We also have different territories in Canada, and in each of those territories, they have their own premier. In each of the provinces, they have their own premier, but then on the national level, there is a prime minister for the entire country. Each of those provinces, they have their individual flags that represent the provinces, but on a national level, there is the Canadian flag that all the province and the territories fall under. So that was the plan for the West Indies. 10 Caribbean islands colonized by Great Britain come together to create one union, one West Indies flag, a West Indies coat of arms. Each islands would keep their own flags and they would have a premier. So they would have each island of the 10 would have their own premier. They would have a prime minister for one island, for the union. So one prime minister, 10 premier. They would also have one governor general, similar to what you find in Canada and Australia. Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago was chosen to be the capital of that union. So in that union of the 10 islands, Trinidad and Tobago was chosen to be the capital of the West Indies. The first Prime Minister of the Union was chosen from Barbados. Sir Grantley Adams was the first Prime Minister of the West Indies, and he was selected from the beautiful island of Barbados. So historians will tell you that the Union, everything was going according to plan for the British government, but for the Jamaicans, Bustamante and Norman Manley wasn't having it. Bustamante was a trade unionist at the time, the Bustamante trade union as we know it today. And in their mind, they're saying that Jamaica was the largest English-speaking island. Of all the 10 islands that were a part of this federation, that Jamaica had the largest population. So historians will tell you that the Jamaicans felt slighted that the capital of the West Indies would be in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and the first Prime Minister would be from Barbados. And Jamaica being the larger of the islands, the politicians of the day felt slighted. So what happened? In 1962, the Jamaican government went ahead with a referendum to back out of the West Indies Federation. And it was successful. The Jamaicans backed out and went ahead to declare independence that same year. So August 6, 1962, Jamaica became an independent nation. And following suit, the Trinidad and Tobago, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, they were the second largest in that union, and they also decided to back out of the union. So Trinidad and Tobago, they backed out of the union also, and in the same year, August 31st, 1962, Trinidad and Tobago became independent. So for those, there are people in the Caribbean that are always of the belief that there's always a rivalry, in particular between Trinidad and Tobago. And when you look at history, it's not a rivalry between the people of those nations, but I think it's more of a government rivalry, like government pride, because at the time, as I said, Trinidad was very powerful in the Caribbean as one of the first islands to discover oil. Trinidad, in terms of infrastructure, finding oil, infrastructure was the development was taking place in Trinidad and Tobago. So they had a lot of infrastructure, and some people at the time felt that is why Trinidad and Tobago was chosen to be the capital of the West Indies. Even though in Jamaica at the time there was like bauxite, and Jamaica itself was being developed as one of the first place in the world to have trains, to have streetcars, to have running water and electricity, because those two islands were two of the largest islands that the Brits colonized. They were actively developing those islands with trains, with electricity. So that is what people felt that happened, that caused the feud between Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, and why the federation, just completely fell apart. So now, when you think about the West Indies still exists, but it only covers cricket. So that was just a brief history lesson of the West Indies Federation and how it all fell apart. So for those that disagree with my assessment that Trinidad and Tobago is the most powerful island in the Caribbean, remember that this is opinion-based. It's based on my opinion, based on experience, study about Caribbean history, and the impact that Trinidad has on the Caribbean overall. But if you disagree, just leave in the comment section why you disagree with my assessment. And I'm going to tell you why I believe that Trinidad is the most powerful island in the Caribbean. So one of the main things that I use to measure the impact on the Caribbean is the politicians in the early 1900s and the decision that they made at that point to move their island forward. So let me give you an example. So Trinidad and Tobago, when Trinidad gained independence in 1962, Trinidad took over government of both Trinidad and the island of Tobago, because Trinidad and Tobago, historically, there were two separate islands, and the British government put them together to make one island. So in gaining independence, Trinidad, the government at the time that ran for a referendum to become independent, they made sure that both islands stayed together. So that's one of the decisions that the government of Trinidad and Tobago at the day made that I thought was an amazing decision. Unlike in Jamaica, at the time, Jamaica was in charge of overseeing Cayman Islands for over 100 years. Jamaica and Cayman Islands were operating as one island. And when Jamaica gained independence, the government at the day made a decision to separate Jamaica from Cayman Island. So when you look at both economies today and you look at Cayman Island, how well they are doing, and Jamaica. So those are just some of the decisions that I believe that the government, back in the early 1900s made. Why I would have to say Trinidad and Tobago, the politicians of the day made better decision. And one of the other decision too was to become a republic. Trinidad and Tobago went on to become a republic in 1976. And even though Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica got independent the same year, the Jamaican government put a commission together in the year 1962. When they gained 62, they thought it was too early to completely cut ties with the British, with the monarch. So they stayed as an independent nation and not a republic. So fast forward, over 40 years later, Jamaica is still not a republic, but Trinidad and Tobago went ahead in 1976 to become a republic. So those are just some of the decision making that I use to form my assessment and why I think that Trinidad is the most powerful island in the Caribbean. People from any other of the islands, the 10 islands that I stated earlier, majority of people would say that Trinidad had more of an impact on their country than any other island in the Caribbean. So if you talk to people from St. Vincent, they will tell you that Trinidad and Tobago has more of an impact on their island. If you talk to people from Guyana or anywhere else in the Caribbean, you would hear that Trinidad has more of an impact. And it has a bit to do with location too. Trinidad is closely located in terms of geographical location to the Windward Islands and to the Leeward Islands, as opposed to like a Cuba, a Haiti, a Jamaica, that they're way off by themselves. So Trinidad, in terms of geographical location, had an advantage there. When you look, because I've had the opportunity to be around people from, I would say, every Caribbean island. And when you look at the cultural impact, just take, for example, food, the culture and food in the Caribbean. When you look at roti, you look at pelori, you look at doubles, and all of those Trinidadian delicacy. When you go across the Caribbean to other islands, you would see that the islands have similar tastes, and a lot of what they use in everyday culture in terms of their food culture has a lot to do with Trinidad and Tobago. So for that reason, I would say like Trinidad, out of any of the other islands, Caribbean islands, have more of an impact on islands, especially in the windward and the leeward side of the Caribbean. So that is one of my reasons for saying that Trinidad and Tobago is the most powerful island in the Caribbean. Yes, so as it relates to music culture in the Caribbean, there's no doubt that reggae music is the biggest music that came out of the Caribbean. But when we talk about being in the Caribbean and music and the cultural impact of music, you can't deny the calypso soca music from Trinidad and Tobago. When you look around the Caribbean, like every other island has a version of Carnival, Vincy Carnival, Vincy Mass, Crop Over in Barbados. So the Carnival, Calypso culture have transcended the borders of Trinidad and Tobago, and every single Caribbean island have some form of Carnival, which is a bigger culture in terms of Caribbean culture. When you look at some of the singers coming out of the Caribbean, you look at like Skinny Fabulous, you look at Destra, you look at just so many Calypso artists coming out of St. Vincent, Barbados, Grenada. So you would have to see that the musical impact that Trinidad has on the Caribbean is more of a widespread impact around the Caribbean itself than reggae music. Reggae music might have a bigger impact on the world stage, but there's no doubt that Calypso music, the carnival culture, has a greater impact on the Caribbean. So this video was just to highlight the impact of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, their contribution to the wider Caribbean, and with Trinidad and Tobago celebrating 62 years of independence, we'd like to wish the Trinidad and Tobago people all the best wishes, and that Trinidad and Tobago, even though in recent times we see what's going on in Trinidad, that there's an increase in crime and it is not as stable as it used to be. My hope for Trinidad and Tobago is that it will go back to those glory days when Trinidad and Tobago was booming in terms of its economy, in terms of its culture and its people. I hope and pray that Trinidad and Tobago will go back to those glory days, and also the wider Caribbean itself will see those glory days when crime reduction and peace and harmony right across the Caribbean. So guys, let me know in the comment section where you're watching from, and please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing content. And remember, peace. I'm out.